Preparing to Testify in Confession Cases, Part 2. In Part 1 of the presentation, Preparing to Testify in Confession Cases, we discuss some of the recommended strategies that Deja Vishnay has suggested for defense attorneys to use in an effort to get the defendant's confession suppressed. Vishnay is a criminal defense lawyer who has specialized in homicide and false confession cases, as well as suppression, trial skills, and providing effective assistance in criminal defense cases. In her book, Suppressing Criminal Evidence, and articles such as Cross-Examining Police in False Confession Cases, Vishnay outlines recommended strategies for defense attorneys to use in an effort to get the defendant's confession suppressed, and how a defense attorney should prepare for the cross-examination of the interrogating officers, detailing what questions should be asked and what issues should be raised. In her book and articles, Vishnay offers a very distorted and erroneous description of the Reid technique. In Part 2 of Preparing to Testify in Confession Cases, we will discuss several of these erroneous and misleading statements. Example 1 of a Vishnay erroneous statement, quote, "The Reid Behavioral Analysis, BAI, is a short 20 to 45-minute non-accusatory interview used to determine if the suspect is truthful. The BAI consists of 17-plus behavior-provoking questions, and the police interviewer then makes a truthfulness decision based on an assessment of verbal and nonverbal responses to those questions. The Reid School claims that the interviewer can evaluate the verbal and nonverbal answers and accurately determine if the subject is lying." Our response is very simply that the Reid interview process, the behavior analysis interview, is in fact a non-accusatory, non-confrontational information-gathering conversation. And at the outset of the interview, the investigator has to be sure to comply with all legal requirements, such as the appropriate advisement of rights. It's important to remember that throughout the interview, the investigator should maintain an objective, neutral, fact-finder demeanor. But the behavior-provoking questions are not the important part of the interview. The investigative interview in the Reid technique should consist of 3 types of questions: questions about the subject's background, questions that are relevant to the issue that is under investigation, and thirdly, behavior-provoking questions. The background questions generally focus on biographical information about the subject, what they do for a living, possibly where they're currently working, if the subject is a youngster, a student, maybe what school they go to, the kind of classes they're taking, that kind of thing. And oftentimes we may engage in casual conversation with the subject, something about a recent news event, maybe a sports story, maybe something about weather that we had in the area, etc. The whole purpose of spending several minutes on these topics is to establish some rapport with the subject, to acclimate them to the interview environment, but most importantly, to establish a behavioral baseline, the subject's normal behaviors, their posture, degree of eye contact, use of illustrators, verbal characteristics, etc. The core of the behavior analysis interview are the investigative questions. The most important element in evaluating a subject's potential culpability in committing a crime or an act of wrongdoing is the content of their statement as compared to the case facts and evidence. This underlying principle is almost always ignored by social psychologists, defense attorneys, and academicians who are critical of interview and interrogation techniques in general and the Reid technique specifically. For example, Vishnay never even mentions the fact that we have investigative questions as part of the interview process. I'll come back to that. The essential element to evaluate during an investigative interview is simply whether or not the case, facts, and evidence support what the subject is telling us, reinforce the credibility of their statements, or whether or not they contradict what the subject is telling us. The investigative questions will deal with the issue that is under investigation, and one of the first things the investigator should do during the interview is to ask an open-ended question that invites the subject to tell us their story. Could you tell me what happened? What did you see or hear? What were your activities during this particular time period? After the subject relates their initial story or version of events, the investigator will then ask a series of questions to develop additional details as well as to clarify who, what, when, where, why, and how of the incident that's under investigation. During the interview, the investigator should attempt to resolve any inconsistencies or any contradictions that may have surfaced from prior interviews of other individuals or from information developed in the investigation. If the subject offers an alibi for the period in question, every effort should be made to substantiate that alibi. The essential element to evaluate during an investigative interview is whether or not the case, facts, and evidence support the subject's story or statement, or whether they contradict the subject's statement. In our book, Criminal Interrogation Confessions, we devote over 100 pages to discussing the importance of investigative questions during the interview process. So it becomes incredibly suspicious, interesting, and curious to note that Vishnay never mentions in her description of the Reid interview process any reference to investigative questions, which are actually the central focus of the BAI process. The third type of questions that we utilize in the interview are called behavior-provoking questions. Behavior-provoking questions are questions that most truthful people to answer one way, deceptive oftentimes answer in a completely different manner. They're typically asked as casual inquiries during the interview. Here's an example of two behavior-provoking questions from the interview of a staff member who's being questioned regarding a sexual abuse investigation in a daycare facility. The think question. John, did you ever think about engaging in any sexual activities with any of the children here at the daycare facility? I think everybody who works here probably thinks about something like that. The punishment question. John, what do you think should happen to a member of the staff who has engaged in sexual activities with any of the children? Well, I guess it depends on how often it happened. The Reid investigative interview process very obviously involves much more than the disingenuous characterization that it is just 17 behavior-provoking questions. One of our investigator tips, which you'll find on Reid.com, is called the Reid Behavior Analysis Interview, Part 1, Do the Case, Facts, and Evidence Support the Subject Story? Part 2, The Interview Structure and the Value of Behavior Symptom Analysis, which provides a very detailed explanation of the interview process as well as several examples in which the case, facts, and evidence contradicted the statements made by the subject during the interview, thereby pointing to their probable culpability. Example 2 of Vishnay erroneous statement. Vishnay states that Reid teaches investigators to evaluate the subject's verbal and nonverbal behavior for indication of truthfulness or deception, and that this kind of instruction is considered junk science by other researchers. It certainly is accurate to say that the majority of research studies have shown that evaluators in general were no better than chance at determining the truthfulness or deception of a subject based on their evaluation of a subject's verbal or nonverbal behaviors, typically in a videotaped interview. However, when you examine the research studies in any detail, there are numerous deficiencies, including the following. The majority of the research consists of laboratory experiments, not real-life subjects or suspects. The subjects, oftentimes students or prisoners, had very low levels of motivation to be believed or to avoid detection, whichever role they were assigned, because they were not facing any real consequences. The interviews of the subjects were not conducted by investigators who were trained in investigative interviewing techniques. The studies did not employ the type of structured interview process that is commonly utilized by investigators in the field. In most studies, and this is critical, there was no attempt to establish the behavioral baseline for the individual subject, so as to identify any changes from their normal behavioral pattern when they were answering questions about the investigation. The research was based on the faulty premise that there are specific behaviors that are unique to truth or deception. There are no behaviors unique to truth or deception. In these research studies, there was no consideration given to the various factors that can affect a person's behavioral responses, such as age/maturity, cultural influences, mental capacity, emotional and psychological stability. In the real world, the investigative interview of a subject takes place in the context of an investigation. For example, by the time the investigator interviews a suspect, he or she may already have developed information about the subject's relationship with the victim, their whereabouts at the time of the crime, their financial situation, and or other relevant background information. In the Reid technique, we teach that there are several rules that need to be followed in the evaluation of a subject's behavior symptoms. Number one, you have to establish a subject's normal behavioral pattern or baseline and then look for changes from that norm or baseline. You have to read all behavioral responses across the three channels of communication: verbal, paralinguistic, and nonverbal behavior. We have to read behavioral clusters, the overall behavioral pattern, not just one thing that was said or done, not one isolated observation. We have to consider the timing and consistency for nonverbal responses. We always have to evaluate behavior symptoms in conjunction with the case, facts, and evidence. And we always have to consider and evaluate the potential impact of possible factors such as the subject's mental capacity, psychological stability, maturity, culture, and physical well-being on their behavior symptoms. If these rules are followed, investigators can be reasonably accurate in assessing a subject's credibility. Unfortunately, these assessment rules were completely absent in the research studies. Example 3 of a Vishnay erroneous statement. Ms. Vishnay describes one of our interview questions, the bait question, as a question that involves the use of a claim of real or false evidence. We teach in our training programs and written materials that the investigator should not lie to a suspect about the presence of incriminating information or evidence during the investigative interview. During the BAI, we do not make any statement to the subject that we have evidence implicating them in the commission of the crime, unless, of course, we do. The bait question is a non-accusatory question that implies the possibility of developing an incriminating evidence. We don't say that we have it. For example, in a non-robbery case in which the subject has denied being in the area where the robbery occurred, the bait question might be phrased as follows. John, the police are currently collecting videos from the stores and apartment buildings in the area where this robbery occurred. When they review the videos, is there any reason that any of them will show you in the immediate area at the time the robbery occurred last Saturday night? Example 4 of a Vishnay erroneous statement. Vishnay says that during the interrogation process, the investigator will tell the subject that they have an airtight case against him or her, but they suggest the belief that if they hear the suspect's version of events, it may minimize the subject's culpability. It might minimize their consequences or punishment. In the above statement from Ms. Vishnay, there is implied leniency in the statement it will minimize the subject's culpability. We teach that the core principles of the Reid technique include the following. Do not make any promises or suggestions of leniency or threats or suggestions of threats of harm or inevitable consequences. Always treat the subject with dignity and respect. Always conduct interviews and interrogations in accordance with the guidelines established by the courts. Do not conduct interrogations for an excessively long period of time. Do not deny the subject any of their rights. Do not deny the subject the opportunity to satisfy their physical needs. Exercise special cautions when questioning socially immature juveniles or individuals with mental or psychological impairments. Example 5 of a Vishnay erroneous statement. Vishnay describes that during the interrogation of the Reid process, the investigator used maximization and minimization techniques. That the investigator will imply that the subject will simply confess and adopt the suggested mitigating circumstances, then the consequences to him or her will be less severe than if they do not. Our training is very specific, that excuses, interrogation themes that the investigator discusses should minimize the moral or psychological seriousness of the subject's crime, but not remove or minimize the legal consequences. And we make this point on numerous occasions. Consider the following excerpts from our book, Criminal Interrogation and Confessions. During the presentation of any theme based on the morality factor, caution must be taken to avoid any indication that the minimization of the moral blame will relieve the suspect of criminal responsibility. A second example. The interrogator must avoid any expressed or intentionally implied statement to the effect that because of the minimized seriousness of the offense, the suspect is to receive a lighter punishment. And a third example. In applying this technique of condemning the accomplice, the interrogator must proceed cautiously and must refrain from making any comments to the effect that the blame cast upon an accomplice thereby relieves the suspect of legal responsibility for his part in the commission of the offense. And as we previously stated, we teach investigators not to make any promises of leniency or threats of harm or threats of inevitable consequences. Example of Fishney erroneous statement 6. Fishney describes that during the interrogation, theme development is the interrogator expressing a supposition about the reasons for the crime's commission, whereby the suspect is offered some kind of moral excuse, maybe affixing the moral blame to the victim, an accomplice, their life circumstances, etc., so that he or she can accept his conduct and admit to the crime. The theme centers on how the interrogator believes that the subject's actions are not so bad and juxtaposes it against more aggravated conduct, thereby suggesting, certainly indirectly, a lesser punishment. Our response. In developing a theme, the investigator suggests a possible reason for the commission of the crime based on a moral or psychological justification because of the phenomena called techniques of neutralization. Techniques of neutralization form the basis of a concept known as neutralization was developed by sociologists Matza and Sykes in the 1950s. The theory holds that criminals are able to neutralize values that would otherwise prohibit them from carrying out certain acts by using one or up to 5 methods of justification: denial of responsibility, denial of injury, denial of the victim, condemnation of the condemners, and appealing to higher loyalties. Given the use of rationalizations by criminal offenders, the suggestion by an investigator that the accomplice talked them into committing the act under investigation, suggesting that the victim was accidentally shot, suggesting that the subject's financial pressures caused him to act out of character, or even blaming the victim for doing or saying something that provoked the incident, are oftentimes simply justification that the subject has already adopted. Furthermore, we never tell the subject that if they had a good reason for committing the crime, he will receive less punishment. For additional details of techniques on neutralization, see our investigator tip, Is offering a suspect a moral or psychological excuse for committing the crime the same as offering them a promise of leniency if they confess? Example 7 of a Vishney erroneous statement. Vishney erroneously states that Reid acknowledges that innocent people confess in the context of the Reid technique and references one of our investigator tips, quote, the importance of accurate corroboration without a confession, as the source of this statement. Response. What we stated in the referenced investigator tip was that innocent people can be coerced into confessing when threatened, promised leniency, denied their rights, denied their opportunity to satisfy their physical needs, etc. We pointed out the importance of developing corroborated information to substantiate the authenticity of the subject statement. Here are several articles/investigator tips on Reid.com that will be helpful when dealing with false confession experts and the issues related to testifying in confession cases. The Reid technique is a non-confrontational, non-accusatory process. False confessions, the issues to be considered. The Reid Behavioral Analysis Interview, Part 1, do the case, facts, and evidence support the subject's story? Part 2, the interview structure and the value of behavior symptom analysis. Is offering a suspect a moral or psychological excuse for committing the crime the same as offering them a promise of leniency if they confess? I did it. Is that a valid statement of guilt? Responding to a false confession expert in your case. What do false confession experts say in their reports? The disingenuous testimony from social psychologists about the Reid technique. A general outline of Richard Leo's testimony on false confession issues and Reid responses. The Reid policy on the use of deception during an interrogation. What false confession experts say about the Reid technique and our responses. clarifying misrepresentations about interrogation techniques. The truth about the research social psychologists use as the basis for testimony regarding false and or coerced confessions. Principles of practice, how to conduct proper investigative interviews and interrogations. What questions should be asked to determine the voluntariness and validity of a subject's confession. For more information on the Reid technique, see our book, Criminal Interrogation and Confessions, as well as the investigator tips on our website, reid.com. Thank you for taking a few minutes to listening to this presentation.